and state loyalties, not nationalism. And if they didn't take orders from Abraham Lincoln, and many didn't feel they should take orders from Jefferson Davis, then it's unlikely they would have fallen into a system where there was supreme belief into one national leader, the way that Nazi Germany did with Adolf Hitler. In the documentary on the Confederate States of America that imagines an alternate history where the Confederacy survives in a slaveholder and is very open to the ideas of Adolf Hitler because they both believed in the supremacy of the white race, if you look at how the South acted during the World War II, that's also something to take into consideration. Historian Samuel Eliot Morison noted, writing on the 1940 election between President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Wendell Willkie, Southerners distrusted the New Deal, but the South, he wrote, with its gallant tradition, applauded the president's determination to help the Allies and ahead of any other part of the country, prepared mentally for the war that the nation had to fight. The America First movement, which strove to keep America out of any European war, was most popular in the Midwest and among the descendants of Irish and German immigrants, many of whom had earned their citizenship fighting for Abraham Lincoln. So if the South had won the Civil War, one other factor, if we look at the scope of foreign policy, is that its natural ally would likely have been Britain through ties of trade and culture. Author Sheldon Vonnegut imagines a Confederate victory at the close of his book, The Glittering Illusion, English Sympathy for the Southern Confederacy, imagined the Confederacy becoming part of the British Empire, with the result that instead of entering the Great War in the fashion arranged by President Woodrow Wilson, Southern regiments would charge in from the start, ensuring an Allied victory in 1916 rather than 1918. In McKinley Cantor's rendering of the Confederate victory in his book, What If the South Had Won the War?, the North and South eventually reunite, in large part because of common service on the side of Britain in both world wars. Here's another interesting idea, too, if the South had won the Civil War, that Crocker surmises, is what happened to American imperialistic designs in the late 1800s after the Spanish-American War, when the United States takes possession of Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Virgin Islands, other islands, and the Philippines and places in the Pacific Ocean. So what would have happened with American expansion to the west and the south if the Confederacy had won? Would the Plains Indians still be running free? This is something that some people think is possible because the South had American Indian allies, the most famous being the Cherokee Brigadier General Stand Watie, but so did the North. And I think it's very unlikely that westward expansion wouldn't have continued with the South the way that it did with the North. Some argue that the South had won the Civil War, that Confederates and American Indians would have existed amicably, that with the Indians hunting buffalo on the plains and Confederate statesmen continuing a laissez-faire economic system, but I think that hews too much into believing the better angels of one's nature, which simply is not how American history rolled out. So I think it's too much of wishful belief that the South wouldn't have been imperialist in the way that the rest of the United States was in the late 19th century. And the term imperialist was not considered pejorative in early America. Thomas Jefferson called America an empire of liberty, and he believed in the idea of manifest destiny before the term was invented, with the intentions of the Lewis and Clark expedition to map the United States and eventually colonize it. He also believed the United States should invade and conquer Canada. And it wasn't Northerners who annexed Florida, it was Andrew Jackson who said he'd be happy to take Cuba next, and he built his career as a fighter against American Indians. It wasn't Northerners who took Texas from Mexico, it was Southerners who were most ardent for the Mexican War, and it was the Southern president, James K. Polk, who said that thanks to the Treaty of Hidalgo that ended the Mexican-American War, there will be added to the United States an immense empire, the value of which 20 years hence would be difficult to calculate. Also, it was Southerners who had dreams of a cotton kingdom extending into Latin America, and Southern politicians, like Secretary of War Jefferson Davis and Mississippi Governor John A. Quitman, who supported American filibusters, like Tennessean William Walker, who looked to carve out little empires in Baja California or Nicaragua. In fact, if one imagines that the South had won the war, it's a near certainty that the South would have annexed Cuba, a long-held Southern dream, with all the sugar cane that was growing there, and the type of economy built on slavery that the British exploited very early into the colonization of the New World. In fact, after the South lost the Civil War, many Southerners went to Brazil in order to exploit the slave economy and continue the lifestyle they had before. And I had an episode very early in this podcast about Confederates who go to Brazil, they formed a city, and their descendants still live there today. They've fully assimilated into Brazilian society and speak Portuguese, but there are celebrations held in former settlements of Brazilians where people will dress up in Confederate dress and wave Confederate flags and the stars and bars and everything. So there's an interesting cultural mishmash that happens. So in a way, their movement to Brazil was one of the final remnants of this dream of colonization of the South by Southerners.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
So Crocker closes in his positive take of the Confederacy that overall it was good that the North and the South reunited together to have the blessings of liberty. But he argues that Confederate leaders like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jeb Stuart, Hill are considered Southern heroes, but should also be considered American heroes as well. Now, here's a very different take if the Civil War had an ending that is far less optimistic. This comes from Paul J. Sanders in an article for National Interest called If the Civil War Had a Different Ending. He says, if the American Civil War had ended other than it did, or if the federal government and the northern states decided to pursue a negotiated separation from the South, which some politicians opposing Abraham Lincoln wanted, then residents of the Confederate States of America could still be celebrating their independence today over 150 years later. Their Independence Day could have been on December 24th, the day in 1860 when the South declared its independence, or it could have been on February 9th, when in 1861, the 13 Southern states formed the CSA, the Confederate States of America. So we can't know what it would have looked like if the USA and the CSA would have split in this alternate history, but it's an interesting thought experiment. One of the first consequences is where the two capitals would have been. Richmond, Virginia was the capital of the Confederacy, and if you've ever visited there, something interesting to note is that it is not far at all from Washington, D.C. One question is, would Washington have remained the capital of the United States? The capital was already there on one hand, the infrastructure had already been built up, and the federal government had vested significantly in the buildings and everything else there. But you would also have two capitals existing and staring right across from one another within spitting distance, and it's maybe a couple hours drive between the two. So Richmond and Washington would have both been exposed and hard to defend. There's good reason to think that maybe some would have wanted to pack up and leave and move further north. The national symbols, after all, didn't exist there yet. The Washington Monument was unfinished at the time of the beginning of the Civil War and was untouched for 7 years. And moreover, Washington was only the capital of the United States due to a compromise between Northerners and Southerners to move it away from Philadelphia and more toward the center of gravity of the entire United States. So perhaps it would have moved north to the original capital of Philadelphia or New York or somewhere else. So this isn't a huge issue, but it highlights how central the USA-CSA relationship would have been in any subsequent history. If there were a more peaceful negotiated separation between North and South, and it was a peaceful split that lay Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia happened after the fall of communism, then the deep economic interdependencies between the North and South could have been preserved, where the South produces raw materials and the North manufactures it. And there could have been, ideally, a peaceful form of coexistence. But even in this best-case scenario, the CSA would have been fertile ground for European powers seeking to constrain the northern states, and European powers would have tried to play the North and the South off of each other. And strong abolitionist sentiment in the North would have continued. The enduring slavery in the South could have provoked considerable political tension, if not armed skirmishes along the border, like what we saw in Kansas and Missouri during the Civil War, which, yes, there were official battles between the two, but it was mostly guerrilla combat that looked similar to Afghanistan. Northern activists could have attempted to maintain and expand even the Underground Railroad for escaped slaves, or even to foment rebellion inside the CSA. This could have led, perhaps, to another war sooner or later. However, if the Civil War ground on indefinitely without Northern victory, and we had more of an armistice like a North-South Korea situation, or if the South managed a decisive battlefield success, perhaps at Gettysburg, it could have broken the North's will and won independence in an eventual political settlement. If this happened, then the two neighbors would have had a much more tense and bitter relationship between the two. The North would have continued to have its advantages in industry and be economically dominant and militarily dominant, but the South would have leverage of its own. It'd have control of the Mississippi River Delta, which was one of the main transportation and export arteries of the North American continent. And river trade that was so important to the development of the American Midwest, in which crops could be easily shipped out to the rest of the United States and the world, would have been controlled by the CSA. And like I said, they'd be in better geographical position to exercise influence in the Caribbean Sea. But they'd have to kick off a naval construction program, which was always lacking compared to the North. The CSA would have seen this as strategically essential, both to expand their trade, but also to protect the southern states' access to international markets and block U.S. or European navies from the Gulf of Mexico. If the CSA had endured as an independent country, what would happen with the 1898 Spanish-American War? That war resulted from America's intervention in Cuba to support a rebellion against Spain. But what if the CSA supported the Cuban rebels instead of Washington and attempted to secure its southern coast with a friendly government in Cuba? Would the United States have aligned with Spain instead, allowing Spain to keep its empire a little bit longer? Or what if the USA supported the rebels, but the CSA sided with Spain, perhaps in exchange for territorial concessions in one of its colonies? What if the U.S. still had... Would the U.S. still have ended up controlling Spain's imperial possessions, including the Philippines? Would the USA have been concerned and able to resist Imperial Japan's expansion in Southeast Asia? If we move on to the 20th century, then things get way more speculative. And we don't know how long the CSA could have sustained slavery. Would the South have evolved into a South Africa apartheid-style society? And you can definitely argue that it did with Jim Crow, where it did away with legal slavery, but it maintained legal second-class status for its former slaves. Outside of international pressure, a two-tiered discriminatory society could have survived for a very long time, as South Africa did into the early 1990s. And just leaving aside the Confederacy for the second, how would the North have evolved? If the strongest advocates for a weaker federal union and having more state rights had left the Union, would the United States have tilted further in the direction of federal power and Northeast liberal political and social values, with the more populated East dominating the independent-minded settlers in the American West? If so, how would the U.S. have reacted to the labor movement? Perhaps the United States could look more like European countries today, where it's not a collection of states, but federal law would have even more power over state law. All the wars of the 20th century would have looked different. World War I, World War II, the Cold War. The World War I Zimmerman telegram, in which there was an intercepted diplomatic message between Germany and Mexico that outlined a strategy to recruit Mexico to support Berlin in World War I, with the promise of Mexico reclaiming its lost territory in the Mexican-American War, shows that even in the early 20th century, the Central Powers were thinking about how to distract the United States and limit its involvement in the war. You can imagine that European powers would be playing the North and the South off of each other as much as they possibly could. Now, Harry Crocker thinks that in the 1930s that the South would have resisted Adolf Hitler's racist worldview. But if there were a two-tiered system where there were citizens with full rights, and then I suppose we could call them subjects, Black Americans or Black Confederates with fewer rights, that very closely mirrors the Nuremberg laws of how Jews were treated in Germany at this time. But an interesting dynamic is that you would have a perhaps white minority in the South. The Confederate States were about 40% black at the time of the Civil War, and we don't know what the population trajectories would have been, but it's perfectly feasible that you could have had a black majority. Could World War II have led to a replay of the Civil War with deadlier weapons and with bombers attacking USA and CSA cities? Could the Allies have been able to defeat Hitler if the United States couldn't contribute as many troops and ships and planes and invasions of Italy into D-Day, while fighting off a hostile neighbor